This is the LatinNews Podcast. I'm your host, Rich McCall, here in Bogota, Colombia, and my very special guest this week is up in New York. It's the Emeritus Professor of Political Science of the William Paterson University in New Jersey, Martin Weinstein, a recognized expert on all things related to Uruguay, author of at least a dozen books and hundreds of articles about the country, but the ones I know are Uruguay, the Politics of Failure and Democracy at a Crossroads. Professor Martin, thank you so much for coming on the LatinNews Podcast and for sharing your knowledge of Uruguay, a lesser known country, if I dare say it, from South America.
It's my pleasure. It's sort of an adopted second home.
Well, and what a wonderful adopted second home to have. Let's jump right in, Professor. Let's talk about democracy today and a bit of the historic background in Uruguay.
Yes. Well, Uruguay was conceived in an extraordinarily unique manner. It was actually one of the few countries in the world who was not a signatory to the documents that made it an independent country. The British made sure of that because they needed to do something to stop the rivalry between the Brazilians and the Argentines on the Rio de la Plata. The British knew that if they could keep it safe and open, it would be a great point of access for trade with South America. So they had the two grand parties sit down and created a treaty which created the Oriental Republic of Uruguay. Now, why is it called the Oriental Republic? Everyone just refers to it as Uruguay, but that's its official name. It's its official name in all UN and procedures, etc. It really refers to the fact that it was this small part of the geographic extension of Brazil, right next to Argentina on the Rio de la Plata. It was the eastern shore of the Rio de la Plata, and hence Oriental. Anyway, moving on. Uruguay had its usual caudillos and civil war kind of fights in the 19th century, mostly goaded on by the Brazilians and the Argentines, who were still vying to have more control, if not direct control, but really call the shots for this small country cousin to the south of one of them and to the east of the other one. Part of Uruguay's game really changed when a remarkable man named José Batlle y Ordóñez, who ran the major newspaper and was quite an intellectual, quite an entrepreneur, became president in 1903 to 1907, and then again from 1911 to 1914. He was enamored of French socialism. So he had a vision he said, we may be a small country, so we'll have small advanced laws. And his idea was, look, we're so small, why don't we set up corporations for electricity, for the railroads? And this was his vision. And even though he was not president after 1914, he dominated Uruguayan politics, and his party dominated and controlled the Congress. And so Uruguay, by 1929, had set up an enormous number of state corporations. And to have the opposition buy in, it was co-participation. The dominant party, the Colorado Party, would have, let's say, 4 seats on all the boards of these public entities, but the opposition would get 3 seats. So they early on developed this kind of coyuntura in Uruguay where everything could be negotiated and the spoils could be divided. But it wasn't just spoils. It was the idea that, all right, where does our money come from? It comes from the export of the wool and the meat. Thank God for England. What England did by making Argentina its principal supplier, it added, Uruguay was just a small appendix, exporting the same things. But the population difference was such that the impact on Uruguay, especially with a leadership that wanted to use that money to build schools and hospitals and roads and run these state corporations, led to a remarkable amount of civil development, democratic discourse, and a decent lifestyle for much of the population. And Montevideo, the capital of the country, became sort of an oversized head of the whole country, because half the population has lived in the capital of Montevideo, the city, and the department, like we would call it either a county or a state. And so that's where everything was, and that's where all the games were played. But the secret rule, not so secret, was the countryside was left in the hands of large landowners, large cattle owners, and they weren't threatened by, we're going to take it away. Even though the country was socialistic, they simply had to pay large export duties to get that stuff to England and elsewhere, and the government used that money for development. What changed for Uruguay, and I'm going to fast forward now to the 1940s and early 50s, Uruguay had a boom again after a slowdown in the Depression. The whole world had that situation. Uruguay had a very good period in the 40s and early 50s, complements of a world war and the Korean War. What got Uruguay into trouble after that was they never adjusted to the changing world after World War II and Korea. In other words, Britain had started using Australia and New Zealand and some of its other colonies for a lot of its imports, and the Uruguayans and the Argentines also never really adjusted quickly or rapidly to this changing nature of international commerce. So Uruguay, this Switzerland of South America, as it was named, and it wasn't named that for the mountains, it was named that for the peace and the banking system and whatever else you want to call it, fell into a period of really little or no growth, a period of tremendous stagnation, which unfortunately led in 1973 to a coup by the military. And that coup was part of the virus, I'll call it a virus, that was affecting Latin America in that period. It started in Brazil in '64. It spread, and by the time the coup took place in Uruguay, the Uruguayan generals were simply and they were never a force. The typical military officer would take their uniform off before they went home. They didn't wear it on the bus, et cetera, et cetera. When the military took over in Uruguay, it was June of 1973. And what happened was it was a remarkable and shocking event, but it was lost to history for a while, because in September of '73, Allende was overthrown in Chile. And so Uruguay, it lost any real being on the radar screen, et cetera, et cetera. The dictatorship would last till 1985. the return of democracy in Uruguay was unique to the extent that the Uruguayan political culture, despite a very draconian regime, it didn't kill as many people as the Argentines did in this period and Pinochet did. But since it was so small, the military really cracked down, controlled it, arrested tens of thousands of people and tortured many of them just to say, don't try anything, don't mess around, this is what you got. In the early 80s, the military decided to write a constitution and present it to the Uruguayan people, just like in Chile. So I'm up here at Columbia and NYU screaming my head off that the Uruguayans are going to reject this thing. And everybody looks at me and says, you're too emotional, Marty. You're too close to the situation. If Pinochet could get the damn thing passed in Chile, how is it going to be rejected in Uruguay? And my response was, you don't know the Uruguayans. They rejected the Constitution. The military in Uruguay had a quiet, nervous breakdown. And 2 years later said, okay, elections, and permitted the traditional parties to come back and run. I can't go into, too many details about that, etc. But the restoration of democracy was immensely successful in the sense that the traditional Colorado ruling party, a very competent man became president, and sanity was restored. The military had been releasing a lot of political prisoners, and they didn't release the head of the guerrilla movement that did exist in Uruguay before the military takeover, the Tupamaros, which were then amnestied in a very Uruguayan way. Some of this leadership had killed some people in firefights, not by assassination, but by if you rob a bank, occasionally someone fires back at you, or if you kidnap someone and you get discovered, or whatever the case happens to be. They were amnestied on the basis of, given how cruelly the situation under which they were kept was, and I have no time to go into that. There's no death penalty in Uruguay. So they had been given the maximum sentence of 30 years. And many of them at this point had served 10 to 15 years. So the government said, given the hardship and the nature of your incarceration, we're giving you double time or triple time for how much time you were in prison. Therefore, they finished their sentence, and therefore they were amnestied. That did not sit well with the military, but nothing ever happened with that in that regard. A remarkable thing happened in the early 90s. A Blanco named Luis Lacalle Herrera beat the Colorado candidate and became the first Blanco to be president on his own since the 18th century. There had been a period in Uruguay, because of this co-participation, there had been a period in Uruguay where the instead of a single person presidency, they went to a collegial executive for almost 15 years. So the Colorados, who were dominant, sharing power with the Blancos, and the Blancos won a couple of those elections, so that they had the majority on the council. They went back to a presidential system with the 1966 Constitution, which is the Constitution still in force, because of the decay of the economic situation. They realized they couldn't do it as an executive. They needed a presidential system again, and that's when they went back to it. In any event, the early 2000s saw a bit of a rough patch because of what happened in the U.S. economy in 2008. The Uruguayan banking system almost froze up, but the U.S. government and Federal Reserve, etc., actually made sure that the Uruguayan banking system did not freeze up. So they never had the banking crisis that other places in Latin America have at this point. I should tell you very quickly that right now in Uruguay is in terrific shape economically. Their peso is incredibly strong, stronger than they would like. And the reason is the crisis in Argentina and the ups and downs in Brazil means that tons of people from those countries park their money in the Uruguayan banks. They also send most of it to the States or elsewhere, but Uruguay is only a country of 3.4 million people. And if you have billions of dollars coming in, your banking system is incredibly liquid. And the peso is amazingly strong. In the run-up of the dollar when interest rates went up, the Uruguayan peso actually strengthened against the dollar in 2022. That was unheard of. And it's still in a very narrow range. And Uruguay has low inflation, but it's still real. Let's say it's 5% a year, 6% a year. But if your peso doesn't devalue, that means prices are going up 5% a year no matter what. And some years it's more like 8%. So Uruguay is not a cheap country. And with the collapse in Argentina, now let me stop here because I probably have gone too much into that. Let's talk about the fact that it's an election year, and we can talk about the same two parties, but they are coalitions, the Colorado Party and the Blanco. Where do you get a name of red and white? You get it because in the civil wars in the 18th century, one faction wore red scarves to differentiate themselves from the other guys on horseback in the countryside, and one guy's wore white scarves. And that's how you get the Partido Colorado y el Partido Blanco. And but these are sort of coalitions. One is a center-right coalition, which traditionally had more strength in the interior. And of course, the Colorados, having run this very liberal social democratic scheme, had most of their support in the cities. After the dictatorship, which ended in 1985, part of the guerrilla movement became a political party. And that political party eventually became a third major party in Uruguay, which started running for the presidency and did not succeed until 2005. But what's very interesting, when the left finally broke through and won the presidency in 2005, they also gained control of both houses of Congress. So a lot of conservatives said, oh my God, this is going to be, a disaster. It was not a disaster. Even though there were a lot of radical people on the left, they didn't try to change anything about the nature of the system. Uruguayans, even the left, Uruguayans are quite conservative, even though the country is so progressive. If you ask them, why don't you change? When you say, yeah, you know who changes a lot? Argentina, Brazil. We don't need that roller coaster. We're very happy to just have the road pretty smooth. The left stayed in power in Uruguay for 15 years, in a period in which Uruguay began to really change for the better in terms of, there were never a lot of cars in Uruguay because typically when cars were expensive and they taxed them like crazy. They said, if people can afford to buy a car and bring it in, I kid you not, the original tax base on bringing an automobile into Uruguay, when I first went there in the late 60s and early 70s, was 300% of the cost of the car. So you would see a Volkswagen being driven by a chauffeur with a little old lady in the back seat. I mean, so you could call it a distortion or whatever, but the one area where I would say the Frente did not succeed was in reforming the educational system. Now, the educational system is good in Uruguay, and you can be born in Uruguay, go through and become a doctor, a lawyer, an engineer, an architect, a dentist, and never pay a cent for your education. However, where the system fails is for the working class and lower middle class at the secondary school level, because there's a dropout rate in this very middle class little country. There's a dropout rate that is really Central American in percentages. It's really a shame, and it's an embarrassment. And the inability to get significant, there is reform now happening under the current administration. But the resistance, sadly, and I said everybody in Uruguay is from the teachers' unions, which are all controlled by leftist parties, but they are incredibly resistant to changing the system. They're not resistant. Uruguay gave every kid in school onto the left a computer. Every kid in school was given a computer, and they're used, and they helped them get through the pandemic. And there's some very sophisticated people working on programming. Uruguay has a small and very successful software business. It exports in the hundreds of millions of dollars worth of software. Because its mathematics department at the main university and the newer universities that have emerged in recent years have very strong computer science programs. One Uruguayan startup, DLO, is sort of the Square of Uruguay, but it doesn't function for Uruguay. It functions to help Google and Amazon sell their product in Latin America and elsewhere. So it's a fintech company. Don't buy it right now if you're intrigued, because it had a big run when it first went public. It was the first unicorn to be listed on the New York Stock Exchange from Uruguay. And it zoomed, but that's not. Anyway, let's talk about the upcoming election. The upcoming election in Uruguay will feature two major coalitions, because as the left got stronger and stronger, the two traditional parties agreed to work together, and they changed a part of the electoral law. So they combined to throw their support to whoever one of the two parties was stronger. And it stopped the Frente from winning in 1999, but did not stop them from winning in the 2000s. There are primaries in Uruguay on June 30th, and they're serious. And the first round of the elections will be October 27th. And if there's a second round, it will be November 24th. There probably will be a second round. The current polls, which are very early and very good in Uruguay, show a virtual dead heat race between who? The government the last 4 years now, and it's a 5-year term in Uruguay for president, has been the Blanco Colorado coalition, with a small group of a small military-based party that is not in good shape right now, but they also supported, and they got about 12% of the vote or whatever. That coalition was headed by the son of the president who was the Blanco president from 1995 to 2000. His name is Luis Lacalle.
Alberto.
Who?
The current president, Alberto, no?
Yeah. He's been very successful, and he's popular. But in Uruguay, you cannot succeed yourself in the presidency. You can come back after being out for a term. So he has handpicked his chief of staff, Alvaro Delgado. Delgado will be the main candidate for the current governing coalition. And he's well known because he was the face of the government during the pandemic. He was a senator and a congressman. All of the people who make it into these rounds of primaries are not loose cannon or wild cards or Javier Malays who come out of nowhere, like in Argentina. He has someone who will run against him. It's a woman named Laura Raffo, who's an economist. She's a very well-regarded economist. She's done consulting for one of the Boston banks in Uruguay or whatever, Bank Boston or whatever. And she is very respected. But I don't think she can possibly beat the guy that's been anointed by the sitting president. I do predict that he will ask her to join the team as his vice president.
Strong prediction.
Huh?
That's a strong prediction.
Yes. Well, it's coming, and there'll be a woman president someday, but I don't think in this round. On the center-left coalition, otherwise called in Uruguay, always called the Broad Front or the Frente, for Frente Amplio, which was its original name. The major candidate is the current intendente, we could say governor or mayor of Canelones, which is the province directly to the east of Montevideo. What's happening there is the future of Uruguay to some extent. That's where the free trade zone is, this huge free trade zone. That's where they're building, and this is new to Uruguay, retirement and communities for people who want to leave the city, guard-gated. You can call them guard-gated communities. Many of them aren't guard-gated, and they're popping up by the dozens now, just a half hour from Montevideo, and it's beautiful countryside already. And Google is there, and a lot of people are there for shipping, because the port of Montevideo is now becoming a major port for transshipment in and out of Bolivia, Paraguay, even southern Brazil. The Uruguayan port has one of the best natural harbors in that area of the world. And the Uruguayans were sleepy about this. I have a friend who I can't go into right now who always said if the Uruguayans had really been aggressive as entrepreneurs, they would have turned Montevideo into a Singapore or a Hong Kong in terms of this part of the world. Understand, Uruguay, 3.4 million people. Argentina, 46 million people. Brazil, over 200 million people with huge middle classes and extraordinarily wealthy upper classes. And stuff moves in and out, et cetera, et cetera. The mayor of Canelones, the intendente, is named Yamandu Orsi, O-R-S-I. And what he's been doing with the 5 years there is really impressive. He's gotten international business in there. They expanded the roads. I mean, he will be a very popular candidate. He has another popular candidate for the primary as his competition, a woman named Carolina José. And José is currently the mayor or intendente of Montevideo, which is traditionally the stepping point to the presidency because it's the second most important job in the country. She's a bit full of herself occasionally, in my opinion. She's a trained engineer, She was Minister of Industry. She was head of Antel, the state-owned phone company. She got in a little trouble. They started a big public theater that was put up by the telephone company, and there was a cost overrun. So, but most of that overrun occurred when she left that position, but she was the one who started the project. That will be a hotly contested. In other words, it'll be closer than the primary on the other side. But I think at the end of the day, Orsi will be the nominee, and he will ask José to be his vice presidential nominee. I will not predict the election. I will eventually, but not this early. It's too close. I will.
Professor, yeah. Can I jump in and ask then? Let's say we've got an Orsi Delgado election runoff November 24th. I'm not asking you to predict. What I'd like to hear, because we know that Uruguay is exemplary in its democracy in Latin America, and it's come top in the latest Transparency International Corruption Perceptions Index and so on. What are the major challenges for whoever gets in post 24 November? Let's say, I mean, we know that organized crime is increasing through Latin America. Uruguay continues to have issues with Mercosur and the bilateral trade that they would like to do with China. There are some things on the horizon.
Yes, it's a very good question. And I think the first thing I need to say, and it relates to the election, Uruguay has recently had a spate of scandals, and the most important one has involved drugs. There's a 32-year-old Uruguayan named Sebastian Marcet, and Mr. Marcet set up in Uruguay a drug cartel, which he named the first Uruguayan cartel. So you see what kind of mind this person has. Interpol had him on a major list. If you see him, arrest him. We want him. He was found in Dubai with no passport. They had him. He got an Uruguayan passport and left. And the question became, how did he get an Uruguayan passport? When they started investigating at the foreign ministry, and Uruguay, as you said, is very transparent. So the Congress started looking into this, the judicial system started looking into this. And the deputy foreign minister had to resign over it. The minister of foreign affairs held his job until much later, when he called up the now non-functioning deputy foreign minister and said, listen, do me a favor, destroy your emails about this situation. Or this, he didn't know that he was taped when he made that phone call. That phone call was given to the press. He then had to resign. This was so serious that Lacalle, the current president, who was at that moment in Washington for a meeting, sort of one of those summits of Latin American leaders in Washington, and was due to have a one-on-one with Biden, left to go back to try to deal with the situation. It reduced the government's popularity. It's working its way through some investigations. Someone got paid somewhere in the foreign ministry to issue those passports. There's another scandal which the president has not taken a hit on. He had a personal secretary early on in his administration who went into business for himself. And the business was He was getting passports for people who needed passports and were willing to pay for it. His major clients were Russians trying to get out of Russia. No. And of course, he was fired and he's in jail. Yeah. So, but this called into whole question, is Uruguay lost its reputation? Is Uruguay now just like all the other corrupt, blah, blah, blah? The answer is no. It's a hit to the government, which probably could get reelected more easily if this stuff hadn't happened. But the Uruguayans know that the Uruguayans fully expect that it will not be covered up, and we'll get the rest of it. I don't know how this is happening. Marcet has young children. He's only 32 years old, and his family is in Uruguay. I mean, his family is with him right now somewhere. He's negotiating a return to Uruguay. So I think he's prepared to stand. I don't know how or what the deal may look like, but he's apparently going to come back to Uruguay. And if he comes back to Uruguay, he's going to be arrested. I mean, everybody knows that. Yeah. The frightening thing about this is the corruption it produces and the crime it produces at the local level. Because if you're moving cocaine from Paraguay and Bolivia through the port of Montevideo to Europe, some of it is going to be sold on the streets. Yeah. And this has created something that is relatively new to Uruguay. The other thing, quite frankly, the world situation for many years now has been one in which inequality is growing. And inequality is growing in Uruguay. And there are people on the streets, or not quite on the streets, but people who, can't make ends meet and are willing to, break into a home or a car, and in a country that was as relatively crime-free as Uruguay, this becomes a big deal, because it's not that it may be so bad, but it's so bad in comparison to what you're used to, and that's an issue that a new government's going to face, whether it's the Frente government or it's the Colorado Blanco coalition that wins it. The Mercosur thing is very tricky, but Mercosur is always very strange. Two small countries joined the two giants, and the two giants really just want to get their way no matter what. And Uruguay now, the current president Lacalle is intent on an agreement with China, and he's been warned that he can't do that outside of Mercosur. But he's hoping that it's problematic, except Milei, as a libertarian, Milei just gave Uruguay his first gift as their neighbor. Uruguayans, because the port is exploding, they need to dredge the Rio de la Plata to make it deeper, to bring in the biggest ships. And Argentina, as usual, had stalled for years. Milei has instructed his people on the binational commission on the dredging of the Rio to allow dredging of the Uruguayan Channel. Huh. That's a big deal. That really is a big deal, and I think there will eventually, I don't know in what manner, I think there will be a trade deal with China from Uruguay. They're also thinking of joining the Trans-Pacific Partnership, even though they're on the Atlantic, not the Pacific. There's a sense of change in Uruguay in terms of, well, first of all, you see it, the reforms that they made in lowering lowering the duties on bringing cars in. Uruguay is flooded with cars now. You never saw a lot of cars in Uruguay. Uruguay is flooded with cars, and they're in love with SUVs. It's one of their major imports. Is machinery, and cars is a huge major import. By the way, for the audience, people should know that Uruguay's principal trading partners are China and Brazil, because they make so much of the same thing and export so much of the same thing that Argentina does. Trade with Argentina is at most 8%, either import or export. That's all it is. But Brazil and China take 20 to 25% each of their exports. And it's the same on imports. So that, and it's not unusual in Latin America now for Brazil, for China to be either the number one trading partner or the number two trading partner with almost all the countries in South America right now. So it's not unusual. But Uruguay had an old standing relationship with Taiwan on, believe it or not, on rice production. So they sell rice. But of course the main exports are still beef, wheat, soy. Software has become significant enough so that there are company, there are some young entrepreneurs with software businesses that are growing, and that's really very interesting. Tourism to Uruguay is mostly an Argentine-Brazilian phenomenon, mostly in the summer. But Punta del Este is, they're coming up with all these names, the Saint-Tropez of South America, or I would like to say that the Hamptons of South America, if you're a New Yorker. No, it's incredible. Just one quick anecdote. When a guy named Mark Zuckerberg, who's everybody named, when he got engaged, he got on his plane with 20 of his closest friends for Christmas, New Year's, and dropped $2 million in Uruguay, having a good time for a week. That story was front page. This is years ago. He's been married quite a few years now. But the number of private jets that go into that small airport in Punta del Este, Christmas, New Year's times, is unbelievable. And the Argentines with money own apartments, they own homes, and they still come. It's a relatively short season. The boom time is just before Christmas to the second half of January, but into February, there's an enormous amount of tourist dollars. What's interesting, Argentines with businesses in Argentina, family in Argentina, are in significant numbers giving up on living in Argentina, and they're moving to Uruguay. And a lot of them know Punta, and they're buying and living full-time in Punta del Este. And there are schools, private schools are being built as extensions of private schools in Montevideo. There's public schools being built to handle, because they're coming with families. And Uruguay has made it easy to come and get a tax holiday, because you need to invest a relatively small amount of money in order to do that. The biggest attraction, and that has helped, I don't know the numbers, but it's in the tens of thousands now, which again, numbers are not big in Uruguay, but you're only dealing with 3.4 million people. Yeah. So when you say that, maybe 10 to 20,000 Argentines have actually done this, it's a large number. And Punta is becoming a year-round city. It's, I wouldn't say it's a big deal year-round, but the challenge is, I think the biggest challenge, believe it or not, would still be, and I have a friend at the Harvard Business School who does research on this, is still some significant reforms in the primary and secondary school systems to give kids from working class homes and even middle class homes a sense of how their schooling relates to the world and how it relates to their job prospects. They get bored. The system is too locked into classical French rote memorization. And it just turns kids off. I'm not saying that's again, they're using computers, they're getting more, and it's changing, but it's really, for a country that is so stable and has such a democratic political culture, they really need to bring that system forward and reduce the dropout rate significantly. And that would do a lot of things about crime and mischief and other things. And they really have to do something major about stopping the use of the port for the shipment of drugs. There was a recent drug bust in Belgium. This is in December.
Yeah.
A shipment of alfajores. People who know Argentina, these are a two-sided cookie filled with dulce de leche, and everybody eats them everywhere. There was a huge shipment of these to Belgium. It should have set up red flags, because there's never been a shipment of alfajores to Belgium, and they were not being shipped directly from the manufacturer. They were being shipped from somebody else. Now, there was an inspection, and they were shipped from the free trade zone, and they were scoped or something with a machine that some guy said, it's not the best machine or whatever. But this is a little on the scary side. It was detected in Belgium. 2.1 tons of cocaine. This was one of those shipments that a cartel plans for a year, never does it again the same way. But it gives you an idea. And all of this happened because of the pandemic. Uruguay was not a major route. The pandemic shut down the airlines. It shut down a lot of stuff. And they said, how are we going to move it out? And they said, the Port of Montevideo. That's interesting. I don't want to end on that kind of...
Well, Professor, I think we do need to wind down, but it's been absolutely fascinating. What I feel, despite the security and obviously organized crime links, is it will still be a positive time when we think of the democratic and peaceful alternation of power, when we look at the elections. And it's obviously no mystery to the political parties what needs to be done in terms of the education. And with this, I would say, pretty progressive attitude towards politics and so on, perhaps either the Frente Amplio or the Partido Nacional will actually invest in this, because it just seems like we can continue to say that Uruguay is a success story.
I absolutely agree 100%. It will be, as usual, one of the most transparent and clean elections carried out. We don't have time to go into the procedures, but it's virtually foolproof. Elections can be extremely close. No one ever has said, I don't believe the result, or, it's always accepted because so many people participate in observing in all of the voting places, and it is virtually foolproof. It should be a model around the world. It can't be duplicated because it's a small country and has been that democratic for so long. It has come up with a system that everybody knows that the votes are real and the votes are counted, and they're counted honestly.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much for your time, Professor. It has been really incredible to go this deeply into your Uruguayan politics, culture, society, economics. I'm sure you could, I know for a fact you could wax lyrically for hours on this, because I think we've only scratched the surface of your knowledge. It's been an absolute pleasure. This has been the LatinNews Podcast. I've been your host, Richard McCall, here in Bogota, Colombia. Our guest is the Emeritus Professor of Political Science, Martin Weinstein of William Paterson University in New Jersey, author of books such as Uruguay, The Politics of Failure, and Democracy at a Crossroads. Thank you again so much for your time.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you very much.
So, of course, everybody share and subscribe to the LatinNews Podcast. We'll be back in a fortnight with another episode regarding the region and important events. So thank you for listening, and goodbye.